Casey Anthony was tried for first-degree murder of her daughter, Kaylee Anthony, in 2011. The same year, she was acquitted of first-degree murder. She was found guilty of some other charges, lying to the police, but obviously the most serious charge of the first-degree murder she was acquitted of. And we've been covering a lot of different cases on this channel for the past 2 odd years. And for some reason, even though this case concluded in 2011, still people would still bring up the Casey Anthony verdict and the trial. It would come up in chats. It would come up in comments. I would get certain comments and certain tweets about it. People are still interested in the Casey Anthony trial, which is why what we did on this channel is that we spent the past 2 weeks live streaming the Casey Anthony trial and watching it fresh, with a fresh perspective, because a lot of people actually came to their conclusions and their opinions on the case based on the media reporting on the case. They didn't actually watch the presentation of evidence. They didn't actually watch certain witnesses on the stand. And while we were doing this exercise, while we were going through the past 2 weeks live streaming this trial, a lot of people in the comments would say, wow, I never had this perspective because I didn't actually watch the real trial, which is why it's important to actually watch trials. They're very available right now in today's day and age, and the internet and all these different channels that live stream actual real trials going on. And you actually get a much better perspective of the trial, and you can understand why perhaps the jury may reach a certain verdict. So I'm going to be giving you my opinion of why the jury reached the verdict that they did in Casey Anthony's trial. But before we do, I want to let everybody know a little bit of an announcement that this coming up Sunday, November 9th, at 11 a.m., I'm going to be having a very special show, the Sunday show, and we're going to be joined by a very special guest who actually right now is a criminal defendant. She is facing some very serious charges. And we're going to talk about the charges. We're going to be talking about some of the background and everything that led up to her being charged, which I think are all a bunch of baloney. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be joined with her this coming up Sunday, November 9th. Don't miss it. It's a brand new case. You haven't heard me talk about it yet. And this is a case that's just starting to pick up some traction right now. We'll see what happens eventually with this case. I think the charges should be dropped. We will see, and we'll talk about it on this coming up Sunday. So that is what's coming up Sunday. But let's come back to the Casey Anthony trial. Now, I will just say, and this is just a quick observation that I had watching a lot of trials, watching how judges either allow are more liberal or conservative when it comes to allowing certain questions to be asked on cross-examination. Certainly with the Karen Reed case, there were certain restrictions that attorneys weren't allowed to go through on cross-examination, and you heard my opinion about it. So I do want to say, and just an observation that I made, that Judge Perry also, I definitely had some of the issues that I had were with what he allowed in terms of cross-examination. I think that Jose Baez really wanted to ask a lot more questions on cross-examination in certain ways, and he was not allowed to. I also don't always necessarily agree that however a witness wants to answer a question, that's how a witness could answer a question. And that's something that we found a lot in this trial, that Judge Perry would allow the witness to answer whatever question he wanted. Didn't matter really what the question that he was asked. And he would be allowed to elaborate and explain and go on all these tangents when he was answering, or whatever the witness was answering certain questions, which again, I think is improper. Well, on cross-examination, if I'm asking you a specific question, you got to answer my question. You can't answer whatever question that you want. I didn't ask you for an explanation. I'm asking you a very simple question that you could give. You can answer with a yes or no. And if you can't answer with a yes or no, then just say you can't answer it. I didn't ask you for an explanation. But in this case, we did find a lot, which again, some of the things that just irks me is that certain restrictions on the attorneys during cross-examination and allowing a witness to go on and on and on about answers to a certain question. And this didn't only go against Jose Baez, it also went against the prosecution as well. But it's not something that I love to watch, and it's something that I saw happen in this case. Okay, so that's just one observation that I had about this case. Now, something that I also noticed in this case, okay, if you think about this, if you think what is the most palatable way, if you're the prosecution, to present this case to a jury. Now, I want to tell you that they presented 23 expert witnesses. The prosecution had 23 expert witnesses. Not only did they have 23 expert witnesses, but they had a lot of witnesses in the first 2 weeks talking really about the same two ideas, which was repeatedly brought out by many, many, many witnesses over the first 2 weeks of the trial. And again, for us, we sped everything up, so we were able to get through it a lot faster. But the point was is that they were bringing out two main facts about Casey Anthony. And that was, number one, she's a pathological liar. Number two is that she was partying and having a good time after Kaylee was gone. Kaylee was missing, and what at this point they all agreed was she was dead. Either it was by an accident, by drowning in the pool, or she was actually murdered. But either way, those two facts remain the same. And this is what the prosecution hit over and over and over and over and over again the first 2 weeks. Witness after witness after witness showing how Casey's lying. And then they had jail calls showing how Casey's lying. It was just way, way, way too much. Okay, now I'm going to explain what Jose Baez did to exploit this. Okay, normally you don't want a client who lies. A client that lies is usually not likable by the jury. The jury's not going to like that person. They're going to think that the person is guilty. So nobody wants their client to be caught in lies. Prosecution understood this, but they overdid it. They overplayed this hand way, way, way too much. You know why? Because Jose Baez was able to use this for his strength of his case. How? How do you do this? And this is what the good lawyers do. Okay, the really good lawyers they're able to take a weakness and turn it into a strength. I always talk about all the trials that I've been covering, on the case I've been covering, is that you have to, as a lawyer, understand your case weaknesses and embrace the weaknesses. Okay, now there's two different levels of embracing a weakness. Number one is that you have to get in front of the weakness. You have to let the jury know, I understand this weakness of my case, and it doesn't change the outcome. I still win, even though I have weaknesses. Every single case has weaknesses, and something that always has to be stressed to the jury is that I understand this weakness, I acknowledge this weakness, I embrace this weakness, and it's still not going to affect the way that you should come out in this trial, that your verdict should still be for me. Okay? Now, that is number one, embracing your weaknesses. Number two is that if you're able to actually turn that weakness into a strength, that is where that's what separates the good lawyers from the fantastic lawyers, from the phenomenal lawyers. And what Jose Baez did in this case is that not only did he take this weakness, that Casey Anthony is a pathological liar, right? That was brought out ad nauseum. But what he said is that you're right, she's a liar. She's such a liar that she's so messed up in the head that this is actually to her benefit. It makes her, and he kind of explained that, well, it's because that she was sexually abused when she was a child, and this is why she does these things. And now you start as a juror to feel some sympathy for her, or you could feel some sympathy for her, if that's the reason why she's lying. Or alternatively, if you don't feel sympathy for her because maybe you don't buy the whole abuse story, but what you could do is, as a jury, say, okay, this is someone who is clearly very, very messed up. This is not somebody who lies because they try to get out of something that they did wrong. That's generally how we understand lying. That's how people interpret lying. When you're lying is because you're trying to hide something, which is why it's usually very bad when you have when your client is proven to have lied. But if you can show that your client lies because that is how they operate, they're a pathological liar. They will lie when there's no reason to lie. They just lie. That's how they were raised. That's how they operate. If you're able to tell that to the jury, well, then it doesn't look as guilty when you lie, because this is a person who just lies. It has nothing to do with whether anything's happening. They just lie. That's their natural state. They just always lie. And that was something that Jose Baez was able to do. That is why, if you kept watching the presentation of the evidence, he would reinforce the fact that she lies. Every single time. Yeah. The prosecution would spend 2 weeks on all these witnesses saying and proving that she was lying. And then he would also then go reinforce it. Yeah, she's a total liar. Then he can actually get up to the jury. And as he said in his opening statement, and then again in the closing argument, there is something seriously wrong with her. And now when she's something seriously wrong, it doesn't mean that she's guilty of something. That's why she's lying. It's because there's something wrong with her and she just lies. So that is something that the prosecution completely, I think, spent way, 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 way too much time on, showing that she's a liar. What they should have done, I believe, is have a few witnesses. Yes, it's clear that she's lying. Yes, she's a liar. Okay, move on. Don't spend 2 weeks hitting the jury over the head with this, because then they actually may buy what Jose Baez argued, that, yeah, this is a liar. It's a pathological liar. It doesn't mean that she's guilty. This is just how she was raised. And yeah, he blamed it on some abuse, which was never proven during the trial. But that is that's besides the point. The point was brought out very clearly by the prosecution that she's a pathological liar. Now, the other part of this case, and this I think also is a very, very strong point for the prosecution. I think it got lost a little bit. And that is that she was partying after this happened. She got a tattoo. She was partying. She was out in the clubs. She was dancing. She was in these contests and body contests, whatever. The point is that this is not how a person acts if they just lost their child who they love very deeply. Okay. Now, one of the things that Jose Baez also brought out in his case was to show that she was a great mother. She cared about her child. She would never murder her child. Now, that was also, the reason why Baez brought that out was because he wanted to show that this is not somebody who would murder their child, right? She loves her child. Everybody testified that she was great. They were wonderful together. They just loved each other, Kaylee and Casey. So how would it make sense that she would go and murder him? You're right, but the prosecution could have used that and perhaps should have stressed that a little bit more in the closing argument, which they didn't do, is to say, the defense's case was to show how close Kaylee and Casey were. Well, if they were so close as the defense wants you to believe, that they're hoping that you believe, well, then this is not how somebody who is so close, who just lost somebody, reacts. Now, yes, the idea of partying after was brought out in closing arguments, but I think this specific part, how the defense was so bent on arguing to the jury and bringing out from every single witness how close Kaylee and Casey were, and that is, again, their basis for why she would never murder her, but that also then doesn't make any sense or contradicts the way that she acted right after. And yeah, they brought in some sort of grief expert that says that this is, could be consistent with grief, unhealthy grieving, that you go party, whatever it is, but common sense. Right. And this is, again, something that can be stressed to the jury. Yeah, I know common sense usually comes up, and I think he did say something about, it goes against common sense, but this is something that you can stress to the jury. You can stress to them that, everything can be, unhealthy grieving. Yeah, sure. But just use your common sense. Is this a mother who is so close with her daughter, loved her to pieces, and they were so great together, and they hung out every single day together? And there's videos of them and pictures of them, and they would go swimming and all these great stuff. Is this how somebody would act? It's just not believable. And if you think about it, I think that these are the two strongest parts of their case. The strongest parts of the prosecution's case is she was partying and she lied. But when you turn the lie into something much bigger and you make it that she doesn't even know how to say the truth if she wanted to, and it has nothing to do with whether she's guilty, and you don't stress enough the partying, and the partying was brought up. I'm not saying that it wasn't, but so much effort by the prosecution was on the fact that she lies. This is where the focus of the case is. And what they did is they called, again, 23 expert witnesses. Now, of course, you have to provide the forensics. I understand that you got to have forensic expert witnesses. You got to have them testify. 23 is a lot. Do you need all 23? Spending days and days and days of time of talking about decomposition and bugs, and there's a single here, and there are problems with the forensics in this case. There are problems with it. There was only one single here that was found in the trunk of the car that had some sort of evidence of, they called it branding, of some sort of evidence of decomposition, of human decomposition, right? And there is some trouble with the forensics. And Baez was able to use that. And a lot of the stuff has never been presented in court before. And Baez was able to argue that. And if that is your focus of the case, is on the forensics, if that's how you present the case to the jury, then you're getting away from the common sense element of this, I think. The common sense here is that this is not how somebody who lost a child without murdering them on purpose would go act. They wouldn't go party and enter into these contests with all these clubs. They wouldn't do it. That's the winning argument. When you just tell somebody about this case without them knowing all about the forensics, and you just tell them what Casey Anthony did, their knee-jerk reaction is, of course she did it. But you think she just lost her child and she's grieving? This is how she grieves? By partying every single night and getting tattoos? Like, this is normal for a grieving person? You know, like that doesn't make any sense. If she intentionally murdered her child and now she's free to do what she wants, okay, now it may make more sense. But if you get caught up in all the forensics, you get caught up in all that type of evidence where Baez can start making these type of arguments of that forensics is not reliable and that forensics is not reliable and that's a single here and that's this. When you get away from the common sense argument in this case, then you can kind of get lost in the weeds. And when you have such a long trial, I think that makes it much more difficult to win. I think the prosecution would have presented this case as, this is a simple case. Make it as simple as possible. Yes, you have to put on the experts, but you explain to the jury that this is a simple case. You don't have to run down the rabbit hole of forensics. Yes, we do have to present for you the science behind all this and why it all makes sense scientifically, but use your common sense. What happened here? Is there any other reasonable explanation? So I think that was one part. Now, another part, which really, really obviously hurt the prosecution, and it could be they didn't realize how much this is going to damage the prosecution, is George. George testifies, and from the get-go, and I remember watching the first time he took the stand, he took the stand like 10 times in this trial. The first time he took the stand, I remember watching this for the first time, and I'm like, sheesh, what is he trying to hide? He is being so deceptive. You can tell. I mean, like, you don't have to be a body expert to read the all these signals of deception that he's exhibiting on the witness stand. I was like, sheesh, what is he trying to hide? What is going on there? And then every single time after that, you see the same thing, where George is being extremely deceptive, a terrible witness for the prosecution, terrible. And Baez is able to show this to the jury, and then the jury can start thinking, hey, he definitely has something to hide. This guy, George, has something to hide. Something is not right. And then when you have, after they see that, they see George on the stand for so long, being deceptive all the different times that he was called, and then you get River Cruz, Crystal Holloway, and she testifies once, and yeah, they had some, the prosecution had, some areas of cross-examination, but that's once. And the jury has to decide, okay, who am I going to believe? Crystal Holloway? I'm going to believe George. And even though it may seem like it's not such an important part of the case, I mean, whether George is having an affair or not have to do with this case, but it just shows that he's trying to hide something. He's holding something back. And then remember what he told Crystal Holloway, according to her, was, something that's very incriminating. And yes, they were able to attack that, but that's not the point. The point is that still the jury sees this and they see that there's something wrong with George. He's hiding something. There's something he's very uncomfortable with this trial. Very uncomfortable on the stand. And I saw a lot of people on the stand, and watching these trials with all of you, and then seeing on my own all these different trials. There's very few people that rise to that level of George. Okay, he was just a terrible witness for the prosecution, and that could also tell the jury that they're missing a big piece of the puzzle here. And especially when Baez is able to show that really this is all, it's Casey or George. That's basically how he presented it to the jury. You believe Casey, you believe George. And they saw George multiple times. And then the jury's going to be left with, okay, I mean, there is absolutely something going on with George. Okay, so I also want to make one more point. And that is, I mean, we could go through the different expert witnesses. Dr. Warner Spitz, who was an amazing expert for the defense. But again, when you start going down the rabbit holes of all the forensics expert witnesses, and when you start getting into the bugs, and then you start getting into the maggots, and then the pupates, and all that stuff, what that has to do with the decomposition from the trunk, and then okay, well, was the body in the trunk? Was it not in the trunk? And does that really mean that Casey murdered Kaylee, or was it just that she died in the pool and then somehow the body ended up in there because she wanted to, hide the body, whatever she was thinking at the time? But again, it's really, I think, a case of much more, I mean, when you're the prosecution, of common sense. And it should be presented, I think, a lot more simpler from the prosecution. Now, one more comment, and that is that there is, in this type of case, because it's a largely circumstantial case, right? This is a very circumstantial case. There's no eyewitnesses of what happened. There's a lot of different circumstantial evidence they have to put together, right? So there's much more of an emphasis on the lawyering. Sometimes it depends on how good of a lawyer you are. You always want the best lawyer, right? But in this specific case, the type of lawyer who you are is going to make a difference. And how you can talk to the jury and explain certain things is very important, how you connect with the jury. And something that also was just very, very obvious is that Baez was just a better lawyer. He knew how to talk to the jury so much better than the prosecution. It's just something that either you have, you're natural at. Of course, you can work on it, but he's just natural. He's able to walk through his closing argument was just masterful, what he did. And it was even long, but still it kept your attention. There's an organization to it. And his points were made very well. And just the way that he talks, it was just a master class on closing arguments and opening statements, by the way. One other thing that I want to mention about this case, and that is that there was a very important moment in opening statements where Baez said that George was sexually abusing Casey. And that's really why she lied about everything that she did, because she learned how to lie. She learned when you're in trouble, you lie. So she just always lied her entire life. And this is not in trouble, but anytime anything happens, you just lie. So they got into a situation, and according to Baez, where the Kaylee drowned in the pool, and now they're panicking. So what do? You just lie. Right. And even when lies, you're going to get caught in your lies. You just continue to lie. And this is all because she was, abused by George. And then also there's some allegations that she was abused by her brother. Okay. None of that came in. No evidence at all was presented that she was abused in any sort of way. Okay. There was none. And the only, on the proffer, there's a proffer. And the only thing that came out during the proffer was that Casey told her boyfriend that, something happened with Lee. So again, the jury's not going to believe it. Even it didn't even get to the jury, but that's only from Casey. Casey, if there's one thing that we understand from this case, from this trial, is that Casey lies, right? She is a pathological liar. And then so therefore you can't believe a word that she says. So there has been no evidence that was presented in this case at all that George had anything to do with abusing Casey. Now, there was a ruling by the judge, and this, I think, was a mistake. And I think that if I was the prosecution, again, I don't know exactly all the arguments that were made, but if I were the prosecution, I would be up in arms if I cannot come back to that. Baez made a very big deal about that in the opening statements. And it's shocking. The jury heard it. And it could be in the back of their mind this entire time about this abuse. And maybe that's what caused Casey. And maybe they could have some sympathy for Casey. In closing arguments, the judge did not allow either side to talk about the abuse. Now, I understand why the defense cannot talk about abuse, right? It's very clear because there's no evidence that there was abuse. So you can't make an argument if there's no evidence on the abuse. You can only argue the evidence. But the prosecution should be able to argue that there was no evidence of abuse. Remember what Mr. Baez told you in the opening statements. And some of the theme that Jose Baez was using in his closing argument is that the prosecution is trying to use your sympathy. They're trying to play on your emotions and to look at this case emotionally because you have this cute little girl, and then you'll end up seeing things that really aren't there, like the stain in the trunk. You'll start seeing that stain even though there's no stain there. So the whole theme of Baez's closing argument, or a big portion of it, was that the prosecution here, the state, is going to try to run your emotions and get you to act within your emotions and come down with a guilty verdict. Well, the response to that, and it would only be a fair response, is the prosecution say, we're the ones trying to play on your emotions? What did Mr. Baez mention in his opening statement about George abusing Casey? Was there any evidence at all of that abuse in this trial? No. Why would he do that? Because he's trying to use your emotions. And from my understanding, there was a ruling that the prosecution as well as the defense, of course, should not be able to mention it. You lost your chance. You brought this up in opening statement. You didn't prove it. There was no evidence at all that came out. You can't talk about it. But the prosecution should absolutely be able to argue that point to the jury. Say there's no evidence of abuse. And then you're able to also somewhat attack the credibility of Jose Baez. And that's always very damaging when the jury hears that a lawyer wasn't being forthcoming with them, wasn't being transparent. We all remember what happened in Karen Reed's case when there's some questioning about the back of the sweatshirt being having any holes or damage. That in itself is something that you may not even be able to overcome. So that's just something that's a ruling. It may have made a difference. I'm not sure if it would have made a difference, but it's definitely an argument that could be used to the jury about, they're trying to use your sympathy. They're trying to get you not to look at this evidence objectively. But that was just another part of it. So overall, I think it was a case that was made very, very complicated. I think it was overcomplicated, this case, instead of simplified. And always what you're trying to do is you're always trying to simplify your case. Try to simplify your case, definitely for the prosecution. And even when you have a complicated case, you still tell the jury that it's simple. This is a simple case. Okay, this is a case where a mother wanted to have a good time, and she did it. She lied to cover up, and that's what this case is about. All your common sense is going to agree with that. Now, yeah, of course, we're going to show you some forensics and experts. We have to do that, in order to have a clear record and everything. But that's what this case is all about. It's just simple. And I think that there's a lot of confusion that was caused because of how complicated this case became and how in the weeds the prosecution got. And also, I don't want to take anything away from Jose Baez because he did a masterful job. He absolutely did a masterful job. He completely out-lawyered the other side. He was just the better lawyer, hands-on. And by the way, I think he only had 6 years of experience when he tried this case. He's got some other cases coming up, but he was only 6 years of experience. And I think, by the way, you were able to tell certain parts of the only 6 years experience, or even someone who's as good as Jose Baez, but everyone's got to start somewhere. And even him, you were able to see there's certain parts of the trial where, a more experienced trial would have reacted differently. But still, the way that he was able to connect with the jury, the way that he was able to present his arguments, the way that he organized his closing arguments, went through the different things that he needed to go in order to win the case. All these things, I think, together resulted in the verdict being not guilty for first-degree murder for Casey Anthony. So that is really my, my analysis of this case. It was definitely good to see a lot of people. Some people changed their minds, some people didn't. But it's always good to actually see the witnesses and see the trial yourself, which is what we do here. And that's how we break things down. So that's going to be it for today. Remember, everybody, to tune in Sunday, where we're going to be talking about a fresh, brand new case, November 9th, 11 a.m. Eastern. Join us right back here. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. Before you leave, make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and we will see you next time.